I was working the front desk at a hotel in Amsterdam when an American couple checked in and immediately asked where they could park their car. I told them the parking garage was 2 blocks away. The husband looked confused and said, "2 blocks? How many feet is that?" I stared at him for a second, then said, "About 200 meters. He got more confused. "We don't use meters in America. Can you just tell me in feet?" I did the math in my head. Around 650 feet. He nodded like that made perfect sense, pulled out his phone, and started converting it back to meters, because his GPS only showed metric. I watched him convert feet to meters when I had already given him meters in the first place. His wife didn't notice. She was busy asking if we had ice machines on every floor like American hotels. We had one ice machine in the basement. She looked genuinely upset. By the way, this is the kind of first-hand insight most people never get unless they've actually worked in tourism. I track these stories full-time so you don't have to. If you value depth over drama, you'll want to stay tuned and subscribe. That same week, I had another guest complain that our shower was broken. I went up to check. The shower worked fine. The problem was that he couldn't figure out how to make the water hot. I showed him the single lever mixer tap. "You push it left for hot, right for cold." He said, "This is so confusing. In America, we have 2 knobs. One says hot, one says cold. Why would you combine them?" I explained that this system was actually easier once you got used to it. He shook his head and said, "I've been showering for 40 years. I know what I'm doing." Then he proceeded to take cold showers for 3 days straight because he refused to push the lever left. My coworker told me about a guest who asked if we accepted dollars at the hotel restaurant. She said no, only euros. He replied, "But the dollar is stronger." She explained that we were in the Netherlands, not America. He insisted the dollar should work everywhere because it's the world's reserve currency. She just smiled and pointed to the ATM. He walked away, muttering something about how McDonald's takes dollars in other countries. It doesn't. I checked. Another guest asked me for directions to that big tower in Paris. I said, "You mean the Eiffel Tower?" He said yes. I told him Paris was in France, about 500 kilometers away. He looked shocked. "Wait, we're not in Paris?" I said, "No, you're in Amsterdam." He pulled out his phone and showed me his booking confirmation. It clearly said Amsterdam. He had booked the wrong city and didn't realize it until check-in. His wife was furious. Not at him, at me. She said, "Why didn't you tell us when we booked?" I wanted to explain that I didn't take their booking, that they did it online, and that Amsterdam and Paris are 2 completely different cities in 2 completely different countries. But I could tell that conversation wasn't going anywhere, so I just helped them rebook a train ticket and watched them leave, still convinced that Europe was somehow one big city. I was working at a train station in Brussels when an American tourist asked me which platform for London. I told him there was no direct train to London from this station. He'd need to go to Brussels South Station first, then take the Eurostar. He said, "Can I just take a regular train?" I explained that London is on an island, separated by water, so the train goes through an underwater tunnel. He looked at me like I was lying. "An underwater tunnel? For trains?" I nodded. He said, "That sounds dangerous. What if it leaks?" I assured him it was safe and had been operating since 1994. He still didn't believe me. And this is the pattern I keep seeing. Most people react, but I decode why they think that way. If you like understanding how people see the world, not just laughing at it, this channel is built for you. Subscribe and stay ahead of the surface-level takes. He asked if there was a bridge instead. There isn't. He eventually decided to fly. My friend worked at a restaurant in Rome and had an American customer ask for Italian food, but not too Italian. She asked what that meant. He said, "You know, like Olive Garden. Real Italian, but American style." She tried not to laugh. He ordered spaghetti with meatballs. She told him that's not really an Italian dish, it's Italian-American. He got defensive. "I've had this in every Italian restaurant in America." "How is it not Italian?" She explained that Italians don't typically serve meatballs with spaghetti. Meatballs are a separate course. He said, "Well, that's weird." Then he asked for a Coke. She brought him a small glass bottle. He asked why it was so small. She said that's the standard size. He said, "In America, we get free refills." She told him refills aren't free in Europe. He looked genuinely betrayed. Another server told me about a customer who sent back his cappuccino because it was too small and too strong. She explained that's how cappuccinos are made in Italy. He said, "Can you make it bigger and weaker?" She offered him an Americano instead. He said, "No, I want a cappuccino, just bigger." She brought him a latte. He said, "This isn't a cappuccino." She tried explaining the difference. He insisted he knew what a cappuccino was because he ordered them every day at Starbucks. She gave up and just brought him whatever he wanted. He left a review saying the restaurant didn't know how to make proper coffee. I was working at a pharmacy in Berlin when an American came in asking for Tylenol. I told him we don't sell Tylenol in Germany, but we have paracetamol, which is the same thing. He said, "I don't want paracetamol, I want Tylenol." I explained they're the exact same medication, just different brand names. He didn't believe me. He said, "Tylenol works for me. I don't know if this other stuff will." I showed him the active ingredient label. Identical? He still refused. He said he'd rather wait until he got back to America. He had a headache for 3 more days. My cousin worked at a hotel in Barcelona and had a guest complain that nobody spoke English. She said, "This is Spain. Most people speak Spanish or Catalan." He replied, "But everyone speaks English. It's the universal language." She explained that while many people learn English, you can't expect everyone to speak it fluently. He said, "Well, they should. It would make travel a lot easier." She just nodded and walked away. A tour guide in Athens told me about an American tourist who asked if the Parthenon was a replica. The guide said no, it's the original structure from 447 BC. The tourist said, "But it looks so old." The guide said, "It is old. It's nearly 2,500 years old." The tourist replied, "Why don't they just rebuild it so it looks new?" The guide tried explaining that its historical value comes from being ancient. The tourist said, "In America, we'd fix it up." The guide didn't respond. I was working at a car rental agency in Dublin when an American asked for an automatic transmission. I told him we only had manual cars available. He said, "What do you mean? Everyone drives automatic." I explained that manual transmissions are far more common in Europe. He said, "That's ridiculous. Why would anyone want to shift gears themselves?" I told him it's cheaper and more fuel efficient. He said, "But it's so much work." Then he asked if I could teach him to drive manual in 10 minutes. I could not. He ended up taking taxis everywhere and complained about how expensive Ireland was. A flight attendant told me about an American passenger who asked why the flight from New York to London was 7 hours when it's only 5 hours coming back. She explained that wind patterns create faster westbound flights. He said, "That doesn't make sense. The distance is the same." She tried explaining jet streams. He interrupted and said, "If the wind is blowing that hard, isn't it dangerous to fly?" She assured him it was safe. He spent the entire flight convinced they were going to crash. I was working at a museum in Vienna when an American tourist asked if we had any exhibits about World War II. I said yes and started directing him. He interrupted and asked, "Did Austria fight in World War II?" I said yes. Austria was annexed by Nazi Germany in 1938. He looked surprised. I thought only Germany was involved. I explained that many countries were involved on both sides. He said, "I thought it was just America versus Germany. I didn't even know where to start with that one." My friend worked at a bookstore in Edinburgh and had an American customer ask for a map of England. She said, "Do you mean a map of Scotland? We're in Scotland." He said, "No, England. I want to see the whole country." She explained that England and Scotland are different countries within the United Kingdom. He said, "But it's all Britain, right?" She said, "Yes. Britain includes England, Scotland, and Wales." He looked confused. "So England isn't a country?" She said, "It is a country, just part of a larger union." He said, "This is too complicated," and bought a map of Europe instead. A tour guide in Prague told me about a tourist who asked what language people spoke in Czechoslovakia. The guide said, "Czechoslovakia doesn't exist anymore. It split into Czech Republic and Slovakia in 1993. The tourist said, "When did that happen?" The guide repeated the year. The tourist said, "I've never heard of that." The guide explained it was a peaceful separation called the Velvet Divorce. The tourist said, "Why don't they teach us this stuff in America?" The guide didn't answer. I was working at an information desk in Copenhagen when an American asked how to get to Switzerland. I pulled up a map and showed him. He said, "That's really far. Can I just walk?" I told him it was over 1,000 kilometers away. He said, "How far is that in miles?" I said about 650 miles. He said, "Oh, that's not too bad. How long would it take to walk?" I estimated maybe 200 hours of walking time plus rest. He said, "So like 2 weeks?" I said, "If you walked non-stop without sleeping, maybe." He genuinely seemed to be considering it. A bartender in Dublin told me about an American who asked if Irish people spoke Irish or English. She said both, but English is more common in daily life. He said, "So Irish isn't a real language?" She said, "No, Irish is a real language. It's just not the primary language anymore." He said, "That's weird. Why would you stop speaking your own language?" She explained centuries of British colonization. He said, "Oh," and changed the subject. I was working at a tourist office in Brussels when someone asked if Belgium was part of Germany. I said, "No, Belgium is its own country." They said, "But you're right next to Germany." I said, "Yes, we share a border, but we're independent." They said, "Do you speak German?" I said some people do, but we have 3 official languages: Dutch, French, and German. They looked amazed. 3 languages in one country? That must be so confusing. I told them it works fine. They said, "In America, we just speak English. It's easier." A co-worker in Amsterdam told me about a tourist who asked why the Netherlands was called Holland. She explained that Holland is actually just a region, not the whole country. The tourist said, "So, what's the difference?" She said the Netherlands is the country. Holland refers to 2 provinces. The tourist said, "Why don't you just pick one name?" She said, "We have. It's the Netherlands. But people use Holland informally." He said, "That's confusing," and continued calling it Holland anyway. I was working at a train ticket counter in Paris when an American asked for a ticket to Africa. I asked which country in Africa. He said, "Just Africa." I explained that Africa is a continent with 54 countries. He said, "I just want to go somewhere in Africa. Can't you just pick one?" I suggested Morocco since it's closest. He said, "Is that in Africa?" I confirmed. He said, "How do I get there?" I told him he could fly or take a ferry from Spain. He chose the ferry because he didn't trust African airlines. I didn't mention that he'd be flying on European carriers anyway. A museum worker in London told me about a visitor who asked why all the signs were in English. She said, "Because we're in England." He replied, "I know, but don't you have your own language?" She was genuinely confused. "English is our language. It originated here." He said, "Wait, so English comes from England?" She said yes. He said, "I thought it was just called English because Americans speak it." She had no response to that. I was working at a grocery store in Stockholm when an American asked where the peanut butter was. I showed him our small international section. He looked disappointed. "This is it? You only have 2 brands?" I said yes. Peanut butter isn't very popular in Sweden. He said, "How do people survive without peanut butter?" I suggested they eat other things. He said, "But what do you put on sandwiches?" I said, "Cheese, ham, vegetables." He looked horrified. "For breakfast?" I said yes. He bought 6 jars of peanut butter to last his trip. My friend worked at a clothing store in Munich and had an American customer complain that all the sizes were wrong. She explained that Europe uses different sizing systems. He said, "Why can't everyone just use the same sizes?" She said different regions have different standards. He said, "America should set the standard since we're the biggest market." She didn't argue. She just helped him find the right size using the conversion chart. He still complained that it was too complicated. A gym employee in Milan told me about an American member who got upset that the weights were in kilograms. He said, "I can't do the math in my head. How am I supposed to know how much I'm lifting?" She offered him a conversion chart. He said, "I shouldn't need a chart. Why don't you just use pounds?" She explained that Italy uses the metric system. He said, "The metric system is too hard." She pointed out that most of the world uses it. He said, "That doesn't make it better." I was working at a post office in Lisbon when an American tried to mail a package. I asked if he wanted to send it standard or express. He asked how long standard would take. I said about 7 to 10 business days to the US. He said, "That's forever. Why does it take so long?" I explained that Portugal and America are separated by an ocean. He said, "Can't they just fly it faster?" I told him express shipping exists but costs more. He said, "I'll just wait until I get home and mail it from there." His trip was 3 weeks long. A restaurant server in Copenhagen told me about an American who asked why there was no air conditioning. She explained that Denmark doesn't get hot enough to need AC in most places. He said, "It's like 75 degrees in here." She said, "That's about 24 Celsius. That's comfortable." He said, "That's hot. I'm sweating." She offered to open a window. He said, "That's not the same." She said it was the best she could do. He left a bad review about the heat. I was working at a phone store in Berlin when an American came in asking why his phone wasn't working. I checked his plan. He didn't have international roaming enabled. I explained he'd need to either enable it or buy a local SIM card. He said, "Why doesn't my American plan work here?" I said, "Because he's in Germany now, not America." He said, "But it's the same phone." I explained how cellular networks work differently by country. He said, "This is too complicated. Phones should just work everywhere." I agreed that would be nice, but that's not how it works currently. He left frustrated. A hotel worker in Brussels told me about a guest who complained about the bed size. He'd booked a standard European double, which is slightly smaller than an American queen. He said, "This bed is tiny. How do 2 people fit?" She explained that European and American bed sizes differ. He said, "Why would you make beds smaller?" She said they're not smaller, they're just different standards. He insisted on an upgrade. She gave him a king-size room. He was satisfied but still said European beds were weird. I was working at a bakery in Paris when an American ordered a coffee and got upset when it came in a tiny cup. He said, "This is an espresso. I ordered coffee." I explained that's how coffee is typically served in France unless you specify something else. He said, "But I said coffee, not espresso." I offered to make him a café American. He said, "What's that?" I said it's espresso with hot water, similar to American drip coffee. He said, "Why is everything so complicated here?" I made him the American. He said it tasted weird. A taxi driver in Barcelona told me about an American passenger who got angry about paying in cash. The driver said his card reader was broken. The passenger said, "Everyone takes cards in America." The driver said, "This is Spain." The passenger said, "It's 2024. Cash is outdated." The driver said he'd accept cash, or the passenger could find another taxi. The passenger paid in cash but left no tip. The driver didn't care. Tipping isn't expected in Spain anyway. I was working at a visitor center in Iceland when an American asked if we had polar bears. I said no, there are no polar bears in Iceland. He said, "But it's so cold here." I explained that Iceland is subarctic, not Arctic, and polar bears live much farther north. He said, "What about penguins?" I said no. Penguins live in the southern hemisphere. He looked confused. So what animals do you have? I said sheep, horses, birds, some Arctic foxes. He said, that's it? I said yes. He seemed disappointed that Iceland wasn't more exotic. That pretty much sums up what it's like dealing with Americans abroad. Don't get me wrong, most American travelers are perfectly fine. They're curious, polite, and willing to learn. But there's always that subset who genuinely believe the rest of the world should operate exactly like America. They can't understand why we use different measurements, different sizes, different languages, different currencies. They want ice in every drink, free refills everywhere, air conditioning in every building, and everyone to speak fluent English. The funniest part is watching them realize that America isn't the default setting for the world. That moment when it clicks that other countries have their own history, their own systems, their own logic that works perfectly fine without American input. Some people adapt quickly. Others spend their entire trip frustrated that Paris isn't more like New York, that Rome doesn't serve Olive Garden-style pasta, that London doesn't have bottomless coffee. I remember one last guest at the Amsterdam hotel who complained about everything. The room was too small. The shower was confusing. The breakfast didn't have pancakes. The outlets were the wrong shape. The TV didn't have American channels. On his last day, I asked if he enjoyed his trip. He said, "Not really. Europe is overrated." I asked why he came. He said, "My wife wanted to see it." I asked if she enjoyed it. He said, "Yeah, she loved it. I didn't say anything else." Maybe that's the difference. Some people travel to experience new things. Others travel expecting everything to be familiar. When it's not, they either adapt or they don't. The ones who adapt usually have great stories about trying new food, learning a few words in another language, figuring out the metro system. The ones who don't just complain about how much better things are back home. And trust me, these stories never stop coming. Every tourist season brings new confusion about metric systems, new surprise about bidets, new shock that not everyone speaks English. It's predictable at this point, but it's also kind of endearing in a weird way, because despite all the confusion and frustration, most people eventually figure it out. They learn that different doesn't mean wrong. They start to appreciate why things work the way they do. And sometimes, just sometimes, they go home with a new perspective. Sometimes they just go home and leave bad reviews. It depends on the person. If you've made it this far, you already see what most travelers, and most channels, miss. I don't chase viral clips. I study culture and behavior in real time. Subscribe now, and next time you'll recognize these patterns before anyone else does.